Why would Jesus, in one of the most tense confrontations of his life, stoop down and drag his finger across the earth? Why would the Gospel of John bother to tell us that he wrote in the dust but never once record a single word of what he wrote? The moment is fleeting. The crowd waits. The woman accused of adultery trembles. The accusers clutch their stones. And in the silence, Jesus bends not to fight, not to argue, but to write. A gesture that feels deliberate. A riddle etched in dirt. A mystery the Bible itself refuses to solve. The drama of that morning softens now, and you imagine the stillness, the dust settling, the scrape of a finger across stone-strewn ground. No thunder, no trumpet, just the fragile sound of earth disturbed. The mystery doesn't shout. It lingers quiet, patient, like a secret waiting to be uncovered. From the very first centuries, readers have paused at this scene. Preachers wrestled with it. Scribes debated it. Scholars puzzled over it. And yet the gesture endures like a shadow at the edge of the story. The Gospels often leave gaps, but this one feels intentional. A silence so heavy it demands to be filled. Did he write names? Did he trace a verse? Was it a legal formula, a prophetic sign, or something else entirely? Tonight we'll follow that trail of dust winding through scripture, history, law, and symbol, seeking to understand a moment the text itself veils in mystery. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You see the scene begin not with writing, but with a storm of accusation. Dawn has just broken, and Jerusalem is stirring awake. The temple courts are already filling with the shuffle of sandals, the hum of prayers, the murmur of early disputes. And then comes the sudden disruption, a woman dragged forward. Her clothes disheveled, her hair loose, her eyes burning with terror. Around her are the stern faces of scribes and Pharisees, men whose lives are dedicated to the letter of the law and whose voices now rise in harsh unison. Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. Moses commanded us to stone such women. What do you say? Their words cut like blades, yet their true aim is not the trembling figure before them. It is Jesus. The trap is set. If he spares her, he seems to defy Moses. If he condemns her, he loses his reputation as merciful. Either way, the net is ready to close around him. You linger here because the weight of the story depends on this charged moment. This is no private whisper of judgment, no hushed sin dealt with behind closed doors. This is public humiliating, staged as a spectacle. And what is most conspicuously absent is the other half of the alleged crime. If she was caught in adultery, where is the man Jewish law, after all, required both parties to be held accountable? The absence of the partner is glaring, and it suggests the entire scene is less about justice and more about manipulation. She is bait. She is leverage. She is, for this morning, at least less a human being than a pawn in a very dangerous game. Historical echoes make this trap even sharper. At this time, Judea lives uneasily under Roman rule, and the right to execute is no longer freely exercised by Jewish courts. To call for stoning is to flirt with political rebellion, since capital sentences technically require Roman approval. The Pharisees know this. They hope that Jesus will stumble either by rejecting Moses in favor of Roman law, or by calling for her death and exposing himself to charges of insurrection. The brilliance of the trap lies in its false simplicity. They ask a question that seems to have only two answers, each fatal in its own way. And yet the crowd must also be considered. Jesus is surrounded not only by accusers and the accused, but by ordinary people caught in the spectacle. They too wait to see if the man who healed the blind and spoke of forgiveness will now speak words of death. It is a social theater, a trial not in a chamber, but in the open square of the temple where everyone is both juror and witness. Imagine the tension in the air, the sense that whatever he said next could tip the fragile balance. Against this backdrop, the act of bending down to write is not simply a random gesture. It is a refusal to answer the trap in the way it is framed. His silence paired with this strange act disarms the moment. But before we interpret that writing, we must first dwell on the power dynamics of the accusation itself. The woman stands at the center, silent, voiceless, her fate being debated as though she were a principle rather than a person. This is one of the obscurities of the scene. The gospel gives her no lines, no plea, no explanation. The silence of the accused mirrors in a haunting way the silence of the writer who kneels beside her. Both silence and gesture shift the entire weight of the story away from the Pharisees' demand and into another dimension altogether. Scholars debate whether the silence of the woman was editorial choice or historical memory. Was she truly mute with fear, or was her voice deliberately erased by the storyteller? We cannot know for certain. But her silence amplifies his gesture. For just as she refuses to defend herself, he refuses to answer the trap. The story becomes less about their words and more about their presence, their postures, their choices. One upright in condemnation, one bent low in accusation, one bent low in defiance. The accusers believe they have the advantage holding the law in one hand and stones in the other. Yet history reveals their weakness. The Mishnah, written down about a century later but preserving older customs, shows the extreme difficulty of carrying out a capital case. The law of adultery required witnesses who could testify to precise detail, including seeing the act itself. The likelihood of such perfect testimony was vanishingly small, which is why actual executions for adultery were rare. Already then the situation reeks of fabrication. The accusers claim certainty where none was possible, pressing a woman into the dust to serve as their living weapon. And here lies one of the enduring questions. Were the Pharisees in the story motivated by sincere zeal for the law? Or were they cynically staging an impossible case to ensnare Jesus? Modern interpreters lean toward the latter, seeing in their maneuver a calculated attempt to destroy his reputation. Yet the ambiguity remains, and it heightens the drama. For if they believed they had a strong case, then his silence would seem all the more subversive. If they knew the case was a sham, then his refusal to speak names their corruption without a word. You may recall from the opening image that the Gospel of John lingers on his posture. He bends down, he stoops, he touches the ground. That detail is repeated as though the writer of the Gospel wants you to feel the motion, to notice the humility of it, the contrast between the lifted stones and the lowered Christ. In the economy of the narrative, that bodily movement speaks louder than any argument. Before even one word is written, his act has already begun to turn the trial inside out. And so the first layer of mystery rests not in the words that may or may not have been traced into dust, but in the scene itself. An accusation designed as a perfect trap. A voiceless woman whose silence becomes part of the testimony. A crowd holding its breath, and a man who refuses to play the game by the rules set before him. That refusal, that bending down, becomes the first sign that the answer will not come in the expected form. The stones have not yet dropped, the words have not yet been spoken, but already the ground beneath the accusers is beginning to shift. There's something immediately strange about the passage even before we ponder the dust, or the woman, or the finger that moved across the ground. You might not notice it on first reading, but once pointed out, it's hard to unsee this story doesn't seem to belong where it's found. The account of Jesus and the woman caught in adultery appears in John 7:53 to 8:11. Yet in the earliest and most respected Greek manuscripts of the Gospel of John, this passage simply isn't there. It vanishes like words erased by a fingertip in sand. Instead, the earliest copies leap directly from a tense discussion about Jesus at the Feast of Tabernacles straight into more arguments over his identity. No woman, no accusation, no stooping. Later manuscripts, often centuries later, begin to reintroduce the story, but even then it migrates. Some scribes insert it after John 7:36. Others place it at the end of John's Gospel. A few wedge it awkwardly into the Gospel of Luke, as if unsure where this orphaned moment should reside. It floats beautiful and haunting, yet textually untethered. And that drift, that manuscript instability, has kept scholars arguing for centuries. The historical fact is undeniable. The story we know as the woman caught in adultery has a murky manuscript history. It does not appear in the earliest papyri. It is absent from Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, those great 4th century Bibles that have become pillars of modern translation work. Even Augustine, writing in the early 5th century, noted that many Greek copies didn't include the episode. That's not a conspiracy. That's a data point. A rather uncomfortable one, admittedly. But here's where things get even more interesting. Augustine didn't see this absence as evidence of fabrication. No, he claimed the story was removed deliberately by men who feared its message. According to him, some Christian leaders thought the tale would be misunderstood, that it might encourage wives to sin without fear of consequence. So rather than trust the people to understand grace, they chose to erase it. Whether that's true or merely Augustine's suspicion, it opens a fascinating crack in the narrative. What if the story's fragility, its instability in manuscripts, isn't a sign of doubt, but of fear? And then comes the even stranger twist. Some scholars point out that the style and vocabulary of the passage feel different from John's usual tone. There are words here that John doesn't use anywhere else. The rhythms feel a touch more Lucan. That has led many to speculate that perhaps the story was originally part of another gospel, oral or written, and was adopted later into John's text, because there was nowhere better to preserve it. It survived not because of where it fit, but because no one could bear to let it vanish. Yet even as it migrated, it persisted. For nearly 2 millennia, Christian communities have cherished this story. Art, music, and sermon have returned again and again to the image of Jesus stooping to write. It's in Caravaggio's brushstrokes and Bach's cantatas. It appears in medieval mystery plays and modern film scripts. There's something about it, something unresolved, something sacred, that refuses to be buried. One might even say its textual homelessness mirrors the moment itself, transient, elusive, traced in dust. That brings us to an obscure but telling detail. In a few later manuscripts, the story is marked with critical signs, asterisks, or marginal lines, signaling to the reader that the scribe was unsure about its authenticity. These signs don't erase the passage, but they do raise a skeptical eyebrow. It's as if the scribes are whispering, "We think this happened, but we're not sure if it belongs here." The story becomes both canon and question mark. Debates continue even now. Should the passage be included in modern Bibles? Many editions place it in brackets or include a footnote explaining its uncertain status. Some scholars argue it was a later addition. Others believe it preserved an earlier oral tradition. And some more poet than philologists suggest it doesn't matter whether it was original to John. What matters is that it survived at all. That it was written, erased, rewritten, preserved. Like the writing in the dirt, ephemeral, but somehow eternal. You might remember from the previous section how this moment breaks the flow of confrontation. Jesus bends. He refuses to answer. He writes. The Gospel of John, a book known for high theological language, logos, light life, suddenly gives us a gritty, physical detail, a dusty silence, a bent knee. Some argue that's why it doesn't feel like John, but maybe just maybe it's why it fits. Because John is also the Gospel that begins with a mystery. In the beginning was the Word. And now, near its middle, we see a Word made flesh, drawing unknown words in the soil. There's something deeply ironic about a passage defined by writing that was almost unwritten. The woman's fate hangs in the balance, but so too does the story's own place in the biblical record. Its inclusion was debated, its authenticity questioned, its message feared, and yet like a trace in dry earth that resists the wind it holds. It clings to the gospel like a whisper that refuses to fade. So what are we left with? A passage that many scholars say doesn't belong yet countless believers treasure. A scene that lacks textual certainty, yet radiates moral clarity. And perhaps most provocatively, a moment of writing that somehow nearly vanished from the very book that chose to preserve it. It's as if the story, much like the woman herself, was brought forward to be judged and narrowly escaped condemnation. The temple courtyard was never just a place of worship. It was also a space of judgment, of arbitration, of trial and consequence. You can picture the vast flagstones underfoot warm in the morning sun, and the clamor of daily life playing out in the shadows of holy colonnades. And woven through all that sacred bustle were echoes of courtroom drama, arguments, settled, disputes resolved, and verdicts rendered beneath the open sky. That makes the scene with the woman all the more layered, because what unfolded wasn't only a theological test. It was also, in every sense, a legal performance. But there's a strange detail buried beneath the dust, a detail that suggests Jesus wasn't improvising when he knelt and began to write. In the legal customs of the Near East, stretching across Jewish, Babylonian, and even Roman traditions, writing on the ground wasn't as bizarre as it might seem. In fact, it may have carried more authority than speech itself. In some ancient judicial settings, particularly those influenced by Babylonian practice, scribes would draw or inscribe words as a symbolic gesture of rendering a verdict. The writing wasn't always meant to last. It wasn't even always meant to be read. It was the gesture itself, the act of marking the ground, that signaled a shift in power. Closer to Judea, Jewish tradition placed enormous symbolic weight on written law. The Torah was a written covenant, and any legal proceeding that referenced Mosaic law invoked the authority of written command. In fact, in Deuteronomy and Leviticus, writing often accompanied legal memory. To write something down was to bind it, to witness it, to make it live. And so when Jesus stooped and traced his finger across the ground, he wasn't retreating from the legal frame. He was claiming it, but on different terms. He wasn't stepping away from the role of judge. He was stepping into it. An obscure but telling clue comes from a lesser-known tractate in the Mishnah, where it's noted that during certain trials, judges would make marks before announcing their ruling, sometimes as a way of pacing their decision, sometimes as a meditative gesture, and occasionally as a public signal. The audience would understand the body language the judge was now deliberating. So when Jesus refused to answer the Pharisees with words, but instead turned his attention to the earth, he may have been evoking that very posture. Not dismissing their question, but weighing it and making sure they saw him weighing it. This interpretation, of course, is still debated. Some scholars argue that Jesus' gesture doesn't line up neatly with any known Jewish legal ritual. Others push back, saying our knowledge of first-century Palestinian law is far from complete, and we cannot assume the absence of preserved documentation means the gesture lacked precedent. After all, many oral traditions and informal customs govern behavior in temple courts, few of which were ever formally recorded. And the Romans, too, had their own habits. In some Roman judicial proceedings, magistrates would draw lines or marks in sand or dust as part of ritualizing the courtroom space, delineating boundaries or pacing deliberation. It's even been suggested that soldiers and governors in the provinces might have adapted this practice with more symbolic flair, particularly in multicultural zones like Judea. Whether Jesus had Roman legal customs in mind is impossible to say with certainty. But the multi-legal atmosphere of Jerusalem at the time, Jewish tradition layered over Roman administration, stirred by centuries of Greco-Babylonian influence, creates a melting pot in which such a gesture could be deeply encoded. What matters most, though, is how the crowd might have perceived it. They didn't need to know Babylonian history or Roman courtroom rituals. All they needed was the impression this man is acting like a judge, not as a rabbi ducking controversy, not as a rebel dodging a snare, but as one who possesses the authority to evaluate the charges and pronounce judgment. The moment he bends and writes, the Pharisees lose the monopoly on legal interpretation. Jesus has entered the courtroom not as the defendant they hope to trap, but as a silent, seated arbiter. There's a kind of poetic reversal at work here. The accusers expected a quick answer, a verbal slip, a rash decision. Instead, they receive a stillness wrapped in gesture. And in that stillness, something unsettling begins to unfold. The act of writing slows the moment, disrupts the rhythm, and throws everything off balance. Some readers have wondered whether Jesus' refusal to speak immediately was in itself a reference to Proverbs, "He who answers before listening, that is his folly and his shame." By delaying, by tracing the ground, Jesus listens not to their words, but to the deeper dynamics at play, the silence of the woman, the violence implied in their stones, the performance of piety cloaking the theater of a trap. And it's here, perhaps, that we glimpse the true mystery of the gesture. Not just what he wrote, but why he chose writing at all. In a culture where the spoken word held enormous power, writing was reserved for permanence, for covenant, for record. Yet Jesus writes in dust, in the most impermanent medium imaginable. The very ground they all stood upon becomes his parchment, his courtroom, his message board. A message meant to vanish and yet paradoxically to echo through centuries. So we're left with an action that feels ancient and modern at once. On the one hand, it may be tied to lost traditions of court ritual inherited from scribes and judges, whose methods were long forgotten. On the other hand, it remains utterly singular, a choice that doesn't quite belong anywhere, yet feels inevitable in that moment. A dusty silence louder than law, a gesture heavier than stone, and a courtroom turned upside down where the accused is silent. The judge is kneeling, and the prosecutors are being quietly tried by their own script. The gesture might have been silent, but it wasn't without precedent. Beneath the dust of that temple courtyard, deeper than law and beyond custom, there may have stirred a whisper from one of the oldest prophetic voices in Jewish memory. Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, once warned of those who turned their backs on the fountain of living water. His warning was vivid and eerily specific. "Those who depart from you shall be written in the earth." That single verse tucked inside chapter 17, nearly forgotten by most readers, has drawn the attention of scholars, mystics, and scribes for generations. Not just for its poetic weight, but for its potential to unlock a moment centuries later. Could Jesus bending down to write in the dust have been deliberately echoing the words of Jeremiah? Was this not just gesture but scripture in motion, a living quotation etched into dry ground? In the context of Jeremiah, the warning is clear. Those who forsake God will not be remembered in books or scrolls, but written in the earth, temporary, fleeting, vulnerable to wind. Dust, after all, doesn't keep records. It forgets. It fades. And those whose names are inscribed in it are condemned not to be remembered. They are already being erased. So imagine the weight of that for the men who stood around Jesus' stones, in hand their certainty sharp and righteous. What if he was writing their names? What if without speaking he was invoking a judgment far older than their accusations, one that cast them not as accusers, but as the very ones who had turned from the fountain of living water standing before them? There's a twist of poetic justice in that idea. These were men of the law, men who prided themselves on remembering Scripture, upholding commandments, embodying tradition. And yet in their zeal they may have found themselves written in the very dust they stood upon, not as righteous, but as rebels, not exalted, but marked for forgetting. But here's where things become tantalizingly uncertain. Jeremiah's verse isn't commonly quoted. It doesn't appear in the daily prayers or in the ritual recitations of temple life. It's not part of the Psalms or the great stories of Moses. It's quiet, subtle, a buried warning, which makes it all the more powerful if Jesus deliberately invoked it. To do so would mean he wasn't just resisting their trap, he was prophetically reorienting the moment. He was pulling from deep wells of memory, dragging the weight of exile and rebellion into the immediate now. Still, scholars remain divided. Some argue that the link to Jeremiah is wishful thinking, a retroactive reading imposed by later interpreters, hungry for meaning. They point out that the verse is too obscure, that no one in the crowd would have caught the reference. But that's precisely the point others make in return. Jesus wasn't performing for the crowd. He was speaking in symbols, teaching in layers, writing in ways that only the attentive or the haunted would understand. And there's another layer too. The phrase fountain of living water in Jeremiah is striking, because it's a term Jesus uses earlier in the Gospel of John to describe himself. He says it to the Samaritan woman at the well. He declares it in the temple. He offers it to those who thirst. So the prophet who warned of names written in the dust also described the consequence they had rejected the living water. That connection, if intentional, wraps the entire gospel moment in a larger prophetic arc. The very thing Jeremiah warned about was now playing out on temple stone. What makes this even more textured is the callback to what has already been seen, the way Jesus disrupts the courtroom, not through resistance, but through inversion. He doesn't accuse the accusers. He lets the dust accuse them. He doesn't recite the law. He writes something older. He doesn't argue. He invokes. Of course, there's no way to know exactly what he wrote. That blank space has frustrated readers for generations. But if it was Jeremiah's warning even in essence, then the writing didn't need to be legible. Its meaning would be felt. The silence would tremble. The accusers steeped in Scripture would know something ancient had stirred beneath their feet. There's an irony here, quiet but sharp. The men who thought they were catching Jesus in a legal trap may have found themselves caught in a prophetic one. They appealed to Moses, but he answered with Jeremiah. They invoked law, but he answered with judgment. Not theirs, his. And then there's the dust itself. So ordinary, so unremarkable. Yet it becomes the scroll, the medium, the message. It is here that names are written. It is here that silence speaks. The impermanence of it all is part of the warning. These names will not last. Their accusations will not be remembered. The earth itself will forget them, Whether that was what Jesus intended, we may never know. But the resonance is undeniable. A prophet once warned of names in dirt, and centuries later, a man knelt and wrote not in scrolls or on tablets, but in earth. The same earth that receives the dead. The same dust to which all flesh returns. The message is stark. If you stand in judgment while forsaking mercy, you risk becoming a name in the dirt. And dust does not keep names for long. The law of Moses had its intricacies, and among them was a safeguard ancient and wise. No one could be put to death on the testimony of a single witness. The law of two witnesses, embedded in Deuteronomy and echoed in later rabbinic teaching, required that any accusation of serious wrongdoing be confirmed by at least two people, preferably more. Not simply any two either. They had to be witnesses with first-hand knowledge, willing to face questioning and consequences should they lie. In matters of life and death, hearsay wasn't enough. Neither was moral outrage. The law demanded corroboration. Now return to that temple courtyard. Return to the woman disheveled and silent. Return to the men who thrust her forward with practiced righteousness. They claimed to have caught her in the very act. A statement that sounds absolute damning even. But the law required more than a claim. It required structure. It required accountability. The question isn't whether they accused her, but whether they followed the law they so loudly invoked. And here lies one of the most troubling inconsistencies. Where were the witnesses? Not the shouting crowd, not the general assumption, but the actual testifiers who saw the act take place. For adultery, the required standard was embarrassingly specific. To convict someone, one had to observe the physical act with clarity. Not assumptions, not vague evidence, actual visible transgression. It was a bar so high that convictions were rare. Adultery was reviled, yes, but proving it, that was another matter entirely. This is what makes Jesus' writing and the moment surrounding it so subversively legal. He never says she's innocent. He never denies the law. Instead, he exposes their failure to keep it properly. Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to cast a stone, he says, but it's more than a call to introspection. It's a legal reframing. According to the law, the hands that cast the first stones had to belong to the witnesses themselves. Not just the morally upright, the legally obligated. If no one among them was willing to step forward as the legitimate witness, then the execution could not proceed. The brilliance is in how quietly this unfolds. Jesus doesn't shout. He doesn't scold. He simply bends, writes, then stands and speaks a sentence that seems gentle but slices through the entire performance like a blade. Not don't judge, but follow your own rules. Not she's innocent, but where are your witnesses? He places the law back in their hands, not to deny it, but to fulfill it more righteously than they had. An obscure rabbinic detail adds even more texture to this moment. In some interpretations of the Deuteronomic Code, a false witness could be punished with the very sentence they tried to impose on the accused. If someone sought to have another stoned through fraudulent testimony, they themselves could be condemned. So imagine standing there, stone in hand, wondering, what if I throw and this turns back on me? Perhaps that explains why the accusers begin to vanish one by one from oldest to youngest. Not because they were suddenly overwhelmed with remorse, but because the moment exposed their legal and moral vulnerability. They weren't just acting out cruelty, they were staging a legally precarious event that could easily collapse on top of them. There's also a delicate callback hidden in how Jesus positions himself. He never challenges the law. He upholds it, even sharpens it, but always toward mercy. It's a thread that's been running quietly since the beginning. He bends down not to avoid judgment, but to force them to confront their own inconsistency, his silence, his posture. His line in the dirt, all of it circles back to this. The law they weaponized is now being held like a mirror, and the crowd watching from the edges begins to understand. This isn't just a teacher caught in a trap. It's a judge turning the courtroom inside out. The woman moments ago the center of condemnation becomes the silent center of justice. The men who arrived to prosecute are now being judged by the very law they claimed to defend. And the writing still unread, still unknown, somehow drives it all forward. There's an open debate among scholars whether Jesus was deliberately invoking the technicalities of Deuteronomy or simply playing on broader moral sensibilities. Some say he was a legal reformer, others a moral teacher, still others a spiritual radical. But there's no denying how deftly he used the law itself not to destroy it, but to reveal its deeper truth. A truth the Pharisees had forgotten: the law was never meant to trap the vulnerable. It was meant to protect them. In the end, no stones are thrown. No verdict is shouted. The accusers drift away, leaving the woman standing no longer surrounded by threats, but by silence. And into that silence, Jesus finally speaks to her, the only words he directs to her in the entire episode. They're brief, gentle, and startlingly free of spectacle. But before that, there is the pause, the vanishing footsteps, the dropping stones, the recognition, perhaps, that law without mercy becomes mockery, that judgment without justice becomes farce, and that the ground itself, disturbed by a fingertip, remembers what the heart forgets. The Roman world loved order. From aqueducts to censuses, from tax ledgers to military rosters, the empire ran on systems rigid, layered, unrelenting. But beneath the polished marble of that machinery, Roman justice was a far murkier affair. Trials, especially in the provinces, weren't always conducted in ornate halls. Often they happened in public squares, on dusty flagstones, or in open courtyards, not so different from the temple precincts in Jerusalem. Justice under Roman rule was sometimes less scroll and gavel, more dust and gesture. In these more informal provincial settings, Roman magistrates were known to carry wax tablets or simply mark the ground as part of their deliberation process. There are recorded instances, sparse, fragmented, but revealing, of Roman judges drawing in sand while interrogating or passing judgment. The act wasn't theatrical, it was functional. A method of recording, contemplating, or symbolizing a decision in progress. For Roman law, especially outside the capital, relied as much on performance and symbolism as it did on statute. Now imagine that courtyard again. A woman in the middle, accusers lined up, the crowd holding its breath, and a man stooping, writing on the ground. To Jewish eyes, it may have evoked Jeremiah. To scribes, perhaps a judgment motif. But to Romanized onlookers, especially soldiers, tax collectors, or temple guards trained under imperial custom, it might have looked like something else entirely: the posture of a provincial judge deliberating a sentence. This was the layered genius of Jesus' gesture. To different audiences, it might have carried entirely different meanings, but all of them authoritative. One act, multiple readings, each one placing him squarely in control of the situation. Not cornered, not ambushed, commanding. And here's the quiet twist: by writing, he may have placed himself not just above his accusers morally, but above them politically. The Pharisees came to trap him under the law of Moses. But by acting in a way familiar to Roman judgment, he sidestepped the jurisdiction they thought they had. Rome held the legal power to execute. And here was Jesus performing like a Roman magistrate, kneeling silent, marking the earth. It's as if he was saying without speaking a word, "I'll play the judge, not you." Some scholars point to an obscure Roman practice known as the notatio, in which preliminary notes or symbols were drawn during a trial, either as a private reflection or a signal to the gathered crowd. These were sometimes scribbled onto wax tablets, but in less formal spaces, especially in colonial outposts or temporary military tribunals, they were drawn directly into dirt. It's not a stretch to imagine that someone like Pontius Pilate, the man who would later wash his hands of another verdict involving Jesus, had once marked judgment with the end of a stylus pressed into loose earth. And so the idea that Jesus, during a legal spectacle, stooped to mark the ground could easily echo that imperial practice, whether intentionally or coincidentally. It's impossible to prove. The Gospel remains maddeningly silent about what he wrote. But the posture, the timing, and the gesture all align with how judgment was sometimes rendered in the Roman world, quietly, visibly, and in sand. There's something ironic here, too. The Pharisees were invoking Moses, but their method, public shaming, no formal trial, unclear witnesses, looked more like mob justice than holy law. Meanwhile, the one they accused was enacting something that in the eyes of onlookers might have passed for Roman legal decorum. The supposed lawbreaker had the poise of a magistrate. The accusers, by contrast, looked more like agitators. This inversion would not have been lost on a crowd accustomed to Roman presence. Jerusalem was no backwater village. Roman banners flew, soldiers patrolled, and imperial rhythms echoed through its daily life. To see someone assume the body language of authority, bending not in submission, but in command, was not just provocative, it was mesmerizing. That perhaps is why the crowd remained silent, while the accusers slowly backed away. Something in the air shifted, not through miracles, not through speech, but through posture. Jesus stooped not in weakness, but in strength, and in that motion something of Rome's own judicial weight seemed to settle over the stones. Of course, interpretations diverge. Some historians dismiss the Roman comparison as coincidence. They argue that Jesus wasn't invoking imperial models, but enacting a prophetic stance, or simply buying time. Others, more attuned to the politics of the scene, argue that everything he did carried double meanings, one for the religious elite, another for the occupying power, and still another for the watching people. What's clear is that the act of writing in this context was not passive. It was a form of judgment, a performance of authority, a declaration made not in words but in dust. And as with any performance of law, Roman, Jewish, or divine, the ones being judged are not always the ones standing trial. As his finger moved through the earth lines blurred, was he a teacher, a prophet, a rebel, or as that motion suggested, a judge? The Pharisees came seeking a slip of the tongue. Instead, they were given a line in the dirt. And though no verdict was spoken, their case was already dissolving like footprints behind a retreating army. Section 8. Writing as divine authority. There are only a few moments in Scripture when God writes, and they are never casual. Words from heaven don't arrive in idle scribbles. They descend with fire smoke, trembling, and permanence. Think back to Sinai. The tablets of the covenant were not the work of Moses' hand, but carved by the very finger of God. That phrase is no metaphor. It's explicitly stated the tablets were the work of God. The writing was the writing of God engraved on the tablets. That act, divine words etched in stone, marked the birth of Israel's law. Writing in this context was revelation power and intimacy all at once. So when Jesus bends down and presses his finger into the dirt, something ancient stirs beneath the surface of the scene. It isn't just a clever deflection. It is perhaps a gesture that echoes Sinai, one that places him not merely as a teacher or prophet, but as a participant in divine authorship. The ground becomes a kind of tablet, the dust a medium of judgment, and the finger that writes. It invites a comparison too bold for many to say aloud, unless you're willing to consider the possibility that he wasn't quoting the law but issuing it. This is where the implications become unsettling. The men who brought the woman forward did so to trap a man they believed to be bound by Moses, but the act of writing reorients the whole framework. Moses received the law on tablets. Jesus in this moment appears to issue one. No stone, no thunder, just a quiet finger in the dust, doing what only God had done before. He is not reacting to their question, he is supplanting it. There's a subtle irony here. The accusers wanted him to confirm the law. Instead, he enacted something older. Before Moses received the tablets, before Israel camped at Sinai, God had already written in the stars, in the land, in the breath of man. And now in a corner of the temple he writes again, not to record a command, but to remind them who has the authority to give it. One obscure commentary from the early centuries, long forgotten by most readers, speculates that Jesus' action mirrored not only the writing on Sinai, but also the mysterious hand in the book of Daniel, the one that wrote a sentence of doom on the wall of the Babylonian palace. That phrase, mene mene tekel uparsin, was a divine verdict, brief, cryptic, and final. Some early thinkers wondered if Jesus' drawing in the dirt was echoing that same kind of judgment, a declaration not against the woman, but against those who presumed to stand in God's place. Of course, there's no way to confirm this. The Gospel does not say what he wrote, but the symbolism of the act echoes in too many directions to ignore. At Sinai, God wrote in stone to bind a people to covenant. In Babylon, he wrote on plaster to expose a king's vanity. And in Jerusalem, Jesus wrote in dust, perhaps, to show that this verdict, like the moment itself, would not be engraved, but vanish. Not because it lacked weight, but because it did not need to be preserved. The impact wasn't in the permanence. It was in the recognition. And here's the callback that now starts to resonate more clearly. Remember the law of two witnesses, how the trap fell apart, not because Jesus denied the law, but because he enforced it more strictly than they had. That's what divine authority looks like in this moment. Not louder, not harsher, just truer. The law becomes sharp again, not in cruelty, but in clarity. The accusers flinch, not because he scolds them, but because he reminds them what the law actually demands and how far short they fall. There's another layer to the gesture, one that some modern scholars highlight cautiously. Writing in dirt is by nature impermanent. It fades with a breeze, a footstep, a moment's delay. So why would someone who once claimed heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away, choose such a fleeting canvas? Perhaps that is precisely the point. Perhaps permanence was not the goal. Perhaps the act was meant to be absorbed rather than preserved, a flash of insight that changes the heart, not a decree etched in granite. And if you think back to how the story unfolds, you'll notice something strange. The woman says nothing. The accusers fall silent. The only sounds are the rustle of garments, the shift of sandals on stone, and the soft scrape of a finger on ground. And yet somehow that silence carries more weight than any proclamation. In the world of first-century Palestine, public debates were often verbal spectacles, arguments traded like weapons. Here Jesus does not argue. He kneels, he writes, and the world tilts. It's easy to miss how radical that was. In a culture saturated with oral teaching, with memorized law and spoken traditions, writing especially in such a symbolic way stood out. Rabbis taught with their voices. Scribes worked in scrolls. But Jesus, in this moment, does something entirely different. He writes without reading. He speaks without speaking. He asserts authority without explanation. And in doing so, he leaves not just a mark in the dust, but an impression on every witness, the kind of impression that doesn't need to be written down to endure. Whether that was a deliberate reference to Sinai or an unconscious echo, the effect was the same. The moment didn't need thunder or lightning to reveal something divine. The dust itself became sacred, and the finger that touched it, that was no ordinary hand. It begins with noise, voices raised, accusations, hurled, the tense choreography of a public shaming in full swing. But then the air thins. No one expects what happens next. Jesus says nothing. Instead of answering, instead of rising to meet their fury, he bends down, touches the ground, and begins to write. It is a silence not of absence, but of absolute control. And in that silence, the trap begins to fracture. In a culture that prized eloquence, this was a defiant inversion. Rabbis argued their points with verbal precision. Pharisees and scribes measured each phrase like currency. Legal debates in the temple weren't quiet. They were layered, technical, combative. To say nothing was to risk looking weak or worse, ignorant. Yet Jesus chooses silence not once but twice. The first time when the question is posed. The second after they press him. And in both moments he answers not with words but with motion. A bent knee, a slow hand, a line in the dust. This wasn't the first time he'd used silence as a weapon. Earlier in his ministry, he had asked questions instead of offering answers. He had replied with parables instead of doctrine. And in one famous moment, he stood before Pilate, silent before the seat of imperial power. That silence wasn't a void. It was a stance, a posture of authority that resisted being baited. Here in the temple, that same strategy plays out again. His silence isn't passive. It is surgical. It disarms without raising a voice. The accusers, expecting a verbal misstep, find themselves caught in a moment that refuses to respond. The energy they brought begins to stall. The spectacle begins to sag. The silence spreads. Some scholars argue that this moment reveals Jesus' deep understanding of rabbinic dialectic, that sometimes to answer is to legitimize the premise of the question. By not answering directly, he exposes the flawed framework they presented. Do we stone her or not? That's the trap. But silence reframes the entire scenario. It shifts attention away from the question and toward the questioners themselves. It says without saying it, "Why are you asking this at all?" There's an obscure philosophical detail worth considering here, found not in Scripture, but in the commentaries of later mystics and sages. Some taught that divine truth resists haste, that to speak too quickly in the face of moral crisis is to risk speaking falsely. In their view, slowness was not weakness, it was reverence, and silence rightly timed was a sign of mastery. Perhaps that's why Jesus doesn't speak until after he has written. Twice he bends down, twice he writes. Only then does he stand and speak. The message is not rushed, it is measured. It ripens in the stillness like storm clouds before a summer downpour. And when it comes, it's only a sentence, one line, no embellishment, no escalation. Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to cast a stone. There's a callback here, not in the form of Scripture, but in mood. Remember how he honored the law not by rejecting it, but by insisting it be followed to the letter. That strategy continues in his silence. He doesn't negate their authority. He exposes its misuse. And he does so not by arguing over law, but by making them feel its full weight silently. You might say this was a courtroom without a gavel, But even more accurately, it was a courtroom where the accused refused to perform and instead invited the jury to examine themselves. That is the power of silence in this context. It refuses to be maneuvered. It turns the trial inward. It becomes a mirror. And then there's the woman, still silent, still center stage. The script gives her no words, no defense. But her silence becomes intertwined with his. Together, their quietness forms a resistance to the theatrical violence of the scene. The crowd expects spectacle. They receive hesitation. They expect fire. They get dust. There's a quiet brilliance to this. Because in silencing himself, Jesus also silences them. The moral fury that drove them forward begins to tremble. The performance unravels. One by one, they drift away, not because they were shouted down, but because they were quietly dismantled. Modern interpreters have debated whether this silence was part of a broader pattern, a theology of restraint. That in refusing to speak prematurely, Jesus protects the sacredness of judgment. Or perhaps he waits for those around him to hear the answer not from his lips, but from their own conscience. The result is undeniable. The courtroom evaporates. The crowd dissipates. The accusers vanish. And none of it required a raised voice. Just a steady hand, a quiet presence, a line in the dust. It's tempting to rush through this part to get to what he finally says, to hear the drama of his judgment. But the weight of the moment lies in the stillness before the speech. That's where the power gathers. That's where the strategy lives. Not in what is said, but in what is withheld. He writes. He waits. He listens to the noise die down. And then, with all eyes on him, he speaks once and changes the course of the entire encounter. There is a phrase that appears only a handful of times in the entire biblical canon, but when it does, it signals something extraordinary. The finger of God. At Sinai, it carved commandments into stone. In Egypt, it terrified magicians when they could no longer match the plagues. And in Babylon, it scrawled doom across a palace wall. Always sudden, always authoritative, always signaling a divine intervention that no human hand could replicate. So when Jesus stoops and presses his finger into the ground, even without explanation, the symbolism pulses with ancient power. The original readers of John's Gospel, and certainly the scribes who copied it, would not have missed the resonance. This wasn't just a finger in the dust. It was a visual echo of the moments when God unmediated made contact with creation. Not through voice, not through prophet, but through direct action. That phrase, the finger of God, is never used in the passage, but its absence may be its own kind of signal. The gesture is there. The dust is real. The judgment looms. And the hand at the center of it all draws parallels that can't be dismissed. Consider first the Exodus account. After the giving of the 10 Commandments, the tablets are described as having been written by the finger of God. These were not just guidelines, they were the legal bedrock of a nation. Their medium stone conveyed permanence, their origin divine. Moses broke the first set in fury. But the idea lingered. God himself had written them. No one would mistake that act for symbolism. It was power made literal. And when Jesus, centuries later, writes not in stone but in dust, the medium changes, but the implication doesn't. The gesture still reverberates with the weight of divine authorship. Then there's Egypt. In the book of Exodus, when Moses brings plague after plague upon Pharaoh's court, the Egyptian magicians match the first few with tricks of their own. But eventually, they reach their limit. One plague strikes, and the magicians step back in horror, whispering to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." In that moment, the illusion of control collapses. The divine breaks in. The phrase becomes shorthand for a force beyond comprehension, one that cannot be imitated, explained, or resisted. In that light, Jesus' finger tracing through temple dust may have carried a similar weight, a sign that the power on display was not rhetorical or legal, but elemental. And then Babylon. The decadent king Belshazzar throws a feast, drinks wine from vessels stolen from the Jerusalem temple, and praises false gods. And suddenly, a disembodied hand appears and writes on the plaster of the wall, Mene Mene Tekel Upharsin. No one can read it. No one understands until Daniel is called to interpret. The meaning: judgment, condemnation, the end of an empire. That hand, the finger that wrote in firelight, became a symbol of divine interruption, the moment when false power is exposed and weighed. Now return to the temple. Jesus stoops. He writes. Nothing is explained. The words are unknown. But the posture, a solitary figure kneeling, inscribing meaning into earth, echoes all these moments. Sinai, Egypt, Babylon, power unveiled. Not by shouting, not by force, but by emotion that recalls the unthinkable, God's own finger moving through the dust of His creation. There's another layer too, a quieter one. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus makes the connection himself. After casting out a demon, he's accused of using dark powers. His reply: "If I cast out demons by the finger of God, then the kingdom of God has come upon you." He could have said power of God or authority or spirit, but he doesn't. He says finger. The detail is precise, intimate. And now in John's Gospel, he touches the earth with that same part of the body, the detail that in Scripture denotes God acting personally. This interpretation isn't universal. Some scholars argue it's speculative, even poetic overreach. They caution against drawing too many parallels between metaphor and narrative gesture. But others see the resonance as intentional, a visual theology embedded in the moment. Because Jesus doesn't just teach with words, He teaches with presence, with pauses, with motion. And the act of writing in public under threat, surrounded by law and accusation, becomes a symbol far greater than itself. The callback is subtle, but it deepens the mystery. The dust, the silence, the writing, they all shift when viewed through the lens of divine authorship. The woman was not just being judged by a clever rabbi. The accusers were not just being outmaneuvered by a streetwise teacher. Something older, deeper, and more cosmic was brushing against that morning's events. A finger once raised against Pharaoh, once chiseled into stone, now gliding softly across the dirt. And yet what was written fades almost immediately. That's the final irony. The divine gesture leaves no readable record, no commandment, no visible judgment, just the memory of motion. It's the reversal of Sinai writing that does not endure but disappears, and in doing so leaves behind a different kind of permanence, one not of words carved into rock, but of silence etched into history. So if the gesture was divine, it was also deeply human. Dust is what man was made from, after all. From dust you came, and to dust you shall return. Maybe the writing was not just judgment. Maybe it was reminder of origin, of mortality, of mercy. One finger, one line, one echo of eternity in the middle of an ambush. And as before, the earth holds the imprint for a moment, before the wind takes it away. It didn't take long for the early church to realize just how enigmatic this moment was. The scene of Jesus writing on the ground, silent, deliberate, and tantalizingly vague, lingered like a question left hanging in the sanctuary air. And with no scriptural answer offered, the earliest Christian thinkers did what they often did with mystery: they speculated. They prayed, and they guessed. Origen, one of the most intellectually daring theologians of the 3rd century, was among the first to offer an opinion. Though known for his careful allegorical interpretations, even Origen seemed hesitant here. He proposed that Jesus was writing down the sins of the woman's accusers, not out of vengeance, but as a quiet unveiling. His suggestion set the stage for a recurring idea that what was written in the dust wasn't meant to be read aloud, but rather felt recognized inwardly by the guilty. No names required, just the unmistakable sting of being seen. Augustine, writing a century later, took a slightly different approach. Known for his command of Latin rhetoric and deep psychological insight, he saw the moment as an expression of divine mercy. For Augustine, Jesus' act of bending down to write was a way to lower himself, to place his body between the woman and her accusers. His silence, his stooping, his scribbling, all were gestures of compassion. Augustine did echo Origen's idea, suggesting that perhaps Jesus wrote the sins of the onlookers, but he framed it within a broader theology of grace. The ones who came to shame left shamed. The one who stood accused walked away free. The dust, in Augustine's view, became the canvas of conscience. Then came Ambrose of Milan, who leaned into the symbolism. He proposed that Jesus wrote in the earth to show that he was fulfilling the prophecy of Jeremiah, not just quoting it, but embodying it. For Ambrose, the earth wasn't incidental. It was essential. Dust was the medium of humanity, the material of Adam, the texture of sin and frailty. To write in it was to speak directly to the condition of man, not to condemn, but to redeem. As centuries passed, more voices joined the discussion. Some suggested that Jesus was reenacting the divine authorship of the Ten Commandments, a callback to Sinai, but this time written not in stone, but in sand. Others proposed he was mimicking Roman judicial practice, or performing a prophetic act akin to those of Ezekiel or Isaiah. Still others simply confessed that they didn't know, and that perhaps the silence was the point. An obscure Syriac commentary from the 4th century imagined something entirely different. In this version, Jesus was drawing not words but symbols: a fish, a tree, a line of separation between judgment and mercy. The act became art, not text and image intended to stir thought, rather than deliver instruction. There is no proof for this, of course, but it captures the mood of the moment. Something was being communicated beyond words. Even among early mystics, the dust writing gained gravity. Some in the Egyptian desert centuries later meditated on the gesture as a sign of how divine truth interacts with impermanence. One moment, the mark is there. The next, it's gone. Like breath on a mirror, like life itself. They saw in Jesus' act a lesson in detachment, that even the words of God may appear in fragile form only to vanish before they are grasped. Still, for all the variety, there were unifying themes. Most early thinkers agreed that the act was deliberate. No one believed Jesus was doodling or killing time. It was a message even if its content was lost. And many agreed that the gesture pointed inward, that it was meant to awaken the conscience more than to instruct the intellect. What he wrote mattered less than what those watching felt. There's a callback worth noticing, especially in how these interpretations mirror what has already been unfolding. Again and again, Jesus refuses the obvious path. He does not argue. He does not condemn. He writes. And in doing so, he turns the burden back onto the accusers. The Church Fathers, perhaps sensing the weight of that, were compelled not to answer the mystery, but to stand in its presence. Of course, not all were satisfied with that ambiguity. Later, medieval writers tried to pin the moment down with more confidence. Some manuscripts from the 11th and 12th centuries begin including glosses, little side notes offering theories as fact. A few suggest Jesus wrote out the 7th commandment: "You shall not commit adultery." Others, more imaginative, claimed he wrote the names of the men matching sin for sin in the dust. These were efforts not to expand the mystery, but to resolve it, to tie the loose thread into a tidy knot. And yet, for all those attempts, the mystery resisted closure. The silence in the gospel text, the absence of a quoted sentence, continues to whisper across generations. The fathers had opinions. The scribes had margins. The mystics had dreams. But the gospel, in its strange restraint, left the space open. That space is part of the power, because in it readers across centuries, and you now, are invited to step into the dust and ask what would have been written for me. For a moment so quietly described, it's remarkable how much weight it carries, and how precariously close it came to vanishing altogether. In fact, for centuries, it nearly did. The story of Jesus and the woman caught in adultery, with its dust and silence and unanswered writing, doesn't appear in the earliest surviving manuscripts of the Gospel of John. No fragment of papyrus from the 2nd century contains it. No 4th century codex features it. Not Codex Sinaiticus, not Codex Vaticanus, not even some of the earliest Latin translations. It seems to have simply not been there, or rather, if it ever was, it was erased. This absence sparked generations of debate. Some saw it as evidence that the story was a later invention, a pious fiction added to soften Jesus' image. Others, more suspicious of the scribes themselves, proposed the opposite, that the story had always been part of the oral tradition and was deliberately removed out of fear. What were they afraid of? The answer, according to several early commentators, was simple mercy. Augustine, never one to tiptoe around controversy, wrote with clarity on this point. He claimed that certain men of little faith, or rather enemies of the true faith, had excised the story from their copies of the gospel. Why? Because they feared it gave women a license to sin. If Jesus forgave the woman, they worried what would stop others from committing adultery with the same expectation of leniency. And so, rather than trust in the nuance of the moment or the power of divine judgment to discern hearts, they took the blade to the parchment. The idea of intentional erasure makes the scene even more layered. The gesture in the dust, so ephemeral to begin with, becomes mirrored in the story's own textual history, written and unwritten, present and absent, like a line drawn only to be swept away. And this wasn't a clean deletion either. As scribes copied manuscripts over the centuries, the story began reappearing, sometimes with marginal notes, sometimes shuffled to different parts of the gospel, and sometimes stitched awkwardly into Luke's narrative. It migrated like a refugee seeking a home, beloved but displaced. One particularly odd manuscript places the story after Luke 21:38, a scene where Jesus is teaching in the temple just before predicting its destruction. The placement almost makes sense. It creates a moment of human drama before the apocalyptic warnings begin. But it's also jarring. The tone shifts, the style changes, the narrative flow ripples unnaturally. It's like a haunting tune drifting into the wrong symphony, beautiful but unsettling. All of this raises the question: who decides what survives? When something this resonant is at risk of erasure, what does that say about the fears of early Christianity, about the politics of canon, about the difference between theology written in ink and theology lived in dust? Some modern scholars, armed with textual criticism and digital reconstructions, argue for caution. They warn against romanticizing lost stories or projecting intention where chance or confusion may suffice. After all, copying errors were common. Scribal fatigue was real, and the idea that one group orchestrated a deliberate removal may be more compelling as myth than fact. But even those who argue for innocent causes admit the omission feels strange. And there's something else, something quietly alarming. In every era, sacred stories have faced redaction. The tension between authority and tenderness, between law and grace, has always left certain passages vulnerable. The story of the woman and the dust strikes too close to that line. It's merciful, yes, but it's also uncontrollable. Jesus doesn't lecture. He doesn't condition forgiveness on repentance. He simply disperses the crowd and tells the woman to go and sin no more. That's it. No catechism. No ceremony. Just dust, silence, and a second chance. To the rigid that can feel dangerous. So the erased record, the vanished manuscript, becomes a kind of symbol in itself. Just as Jesus wrote in dust, knowing the wind would carry it away, so too was this story nearly swept from the gospel. Not by malice alone, perhaps, but by fear. By trembling hands who couldn't quite accept a savior who stooped rather than struck. And yet it survived. The story found its way back into the text, not by force, but by love. Communities remembered it. Teachers preserved it. Worshippers spoke of it long after its parchment trail had gone thin. Like a rumor of grace that refused to be silenced. Like a line in dust that somehow held. There's a deep irony here, and a callback worth holding on to. Earlier we explored how Jesus' act was fleeting, how dust retains no record. But now we find that the story itself mirrored that impermanence. The gospel whispered something the church tried to unhear. But grace, like dust on a breeze, has a way of slipping through the cracks. So what if we're not meant to know exactly what he wrote? What if that absence both in dust and in manuscript is the point? What remains isn't the writing. It's the fact that he stooped, that he didn't shout, that he didn't condemn, and that for reasons as mysterious as the missing ink, someone somewhere tried to make that moment disappear. But it didn't. It remains. Written not in stone, but in the deep memory of the church. A record erased, and yet somehow never forgotten. For centuries, the most popular guess, the one whispered from pulpits, illustrated in medieval manuscripts, and murmured by Sunday school teachers, leaning toward wide-eyed children, is this: that Jesus bent down and wrote the sins of the accusers in the dust. A soft unveiling, one name at a time. Not loud, not cruel, just exposed. There's no textual proof, no secret footnote. The gospel never says that he wrote anything legible at all, but the tradition has survived with unusual persistence. You can almost picture it, a robed elder stepping forward, indignant only to freeze as he glimpses something drawn at his feet. A name, a place, a memory. Something he thought buried, something no one else should know. And in that instant, the stone slips from his hand. The roots of this interpretation run deep, not only because of its moral power, but because of its resonance with Jeremiah's haunting warning that those who forsake the Lord will have their names written in the earth, not in books, not on scrolls, but in dirt, dust, soil that forgets, soil that doesn't keep records unless God touches it. And the theory fits the moment. Jesus, by all accounts, wasn't a showman. His teaching was piercing, yes, but never theatrical for its own sake. So if he meant to disarm the accusers, it would be in a way that didn't require shouting or grand revelation. A name in dust, that would be enough. A quiet indictment seen only by the one who needed to see it. A message written to vanish, but that lingered in memory like smoke. One obscure early Christian homily proposes this very idea with surprising specificity. It claims Jesus wrote, "I know what you did," followed by a name. Then another. Then another. A line of quiet truths spelled out beneath a temple sky. The preacher insists this wasn't condemnation, it was confrontation. A way of saying you stand ready to judge but have forgotten you too live in glass houses made of sand. Modern readers may find this theory irresistible because it affirms something intuitive, that we judge harshest when we imagine ourselves clean. But to be reminded in dust in public without a word that we are not beyond fault, that silences the crowd. There's also a psychological edge to the theory. Imagine the effect of that gesture. You're angry, self-righteous. But then he writes something that no one else seems to notice, and your heart stutters. Your face flushes. You feel known, not admired, not condemned, just known. The very thing you thought buried has surfaced beneath his fingertip, and in that moment, it is no longer the woman on trial. It is you. But there's debate, of course. Scholars raise important objections. Chief among them, if Jesus wrote their sins in the dirt, wouldn't the gospel have said so? Why leave such a powerful revelation ambiguous? And more practically, wouldn't the others in the crowd have seen? Wouldn't that level of public exposure have sparked outrage, not quiet retreat? Those are valid questions. But defenders of the theory suggest that the writing didn't need to be visible to everyone. Perhaps he wrote in a place only the accuser would see as he stepped forward. Or perhaps the words weren't literal, but symbolic, perceived inwardly, a moment of conviction that transcended language. The dust might not have carried names at all. The gesture itself might have stirred the memory. There's a callback to be made here too. Remember how the law of two witnesses unraveled not through argument, but through inward recognition. No one could cast the first stone because no one could claim pure hands. This theory builds on that, the idea that Jesus' act wasn't rhetorical, but surgical. That he didn't just expose a legal flaw, but peeled back the soul. It also dovetails with the idea of divine authorship. If God writes the law on stone, and if God judges kings with writing on walls, then perhaps here he judges hearts with writing in dust. Not to shame, not to destroy, but to return each person to humility, the ground from which they came. There's even a resonance with Genesis, man formed from dust, breath animating clay. Now dust again receives a message not of creation, but of conscience. And the breath that once gave life now stirs the air around a finger drawing judgment in silence. Some mystics have taken the theory further, claiming that the dust in which he wrote contained not just physical earth, but metaphorical memory, that every person carries their own dust, the remnants of choices, the sediment of guilt, and that Jesus with one motion stirred that sediment into awareness, not to punish, but to wake. The woman still stands at the center of all this, silent, watching. She sees men's faces change. She hears sandals scraping backward, but she doesn't know what he's written. No one does. That perhaps is part of the power. The message wasn't for her. It wasn't even for the crowd. It was a mirror held up to each man who came with judgment, a reflection cast not in glass, but in dust. And when the last of them slips away, when only silence remains, the words are already gone. The wind takes them. The ground smooths over. Whatever was written vanishes, and yet no one forgets it. Because the dust may not have held the names for long. But the hearts of those who saw it, they would carry the mark forever. It's a strange thing, the weight that silence can carry in a legal setting. In ancient courtrooms, words were everything: oaths, sworn accusations, shouted verdicts proclaimed. But occasionally, silence said more. And among the stranger theories about what Jesus wrote that day, one of the most elegant is also the most technical, that he was composing a legal formula, a dismissal, a verdict of non-condemnation. Not an argument, not a parable, but a line of ancient courtroom language that quietly ended the trial before it began. Imagine the scene not as a theological ambush, but as an impromptu court. The accusers have brought charges. The accused stands alone. The crowd waits, assuming judgment must fall. And instead of rising to offer a ruling aloud, the one who is silently placed in the role of judge bends down and writes the words, "Not guilty." Or perhaps "No man condemns her." Or even "Case dismissed." The theory draws from a well-documented practice in early Jewish and Roman courts: the use of brief written statements to render judgment. Sometimes the ruling was verbal, of course, but in other cases a line written even temporarily served as the official act. The magistrate might write a name, a charge, a symbol, or a single phrase signaling absolution or condemnation. Then the board would be wiped clean, or the line in the sand erased. The verdict was delivered, the case closed. Some scholars point out that Jesus' words to the woman, "Neither do I condemn you," have the rhythm of a judicial pronouncement. He doesn't explain or justify, he simply speaks the result. And the gospel frames that moment as the only direct interaction between the two. Before that, she is silent, he is writing. But when he does speak, it's the verdict: sparse, final, gentle but absolute. An obscure legal tract from a 2nd century rabbinic collection references a courtroom technique where if witnesses could not uphold their charges, the judge would write a note of dismissal and drop it before the accused, a symbolic end to the process. Whether Jesus was drawing on that tradition or creating something new, the resonance is hard to ignore. His writing could have been a message not of exposure, but of closure. A quiet decree in dust. There's a callback buried in this theory, not just to the dust itself or the crowd's retreat, but to the earlier idea of divine writing as final authority. If God wrote the commandments to establish covenant and wrote judgment on Babylon's walls to declare its end, then here perhaps the writing was not a rebuke, but a release. A God who writes judgment also writes mercy. A finger once used to inscribe law now draws lines of compassion. The argument for this interpretation grows stronger when you look again at what Jesus doesn't do. He doesn't ask the woman questions. He doesn't review the charges. He doesn't call for witnesses or gather testimony. He simply waits for the prosecution to vanish, and then, as the last sandal scuffs away, delivers his sentence. One without wrath, one without spectacle, one without stone. It's the kind of legal act that doesn't need permanence. The sentence once given needs no signature, no seal, just presence, still some pushback. They argue that Jesus wasn't acting as a judge in any formal sense, and that reading the scene as courtroom drama misses the spiritual core. But even if the moment wasn't official in any institutional way, its shape mirrors a trial. The roles are there: accuser, accused, judge, witnesses, law. And if Jesus didn't claim the title of judge, the crowd certainly gave it to him in practice. They asked him to decide. And he did in his own way. There's a deeper irony here too. The Pharisees came expecting him to uphold the law. What they received was something more ancient and more disruptive: grace operating through justice. A verdict rooted not in loopholes or evasion, but in truth, the truth that mercy is not lawlessness, and that judgment without compassion is merely vengeance dressed in robes. The crowd by the end seems to understand. There is no riot, no protest. They came with stones. They left with silence. Whatever he wrote, whatever phrase or formula touched the ground, it was enough to halt the machinery of execution. The law had been satisfied not by blood, but by wisdom. And the woman still, she speaks no words. Still her voice is absent. But when Jesus asks her, "Has no one condemned you?" and she answers, "No one, Lord," the exchange carries the weight of a trial completed. It's not a negotiation, it's a conclusion. He follows not with comfort, but with instruction. Go and sin no more. That final phrase matters. It doesn't erase the past. It doesn't pretend nothing happened, but it makes space for a future. The verdict is not indulgence, it's redirection, a closed case and an open road. So perhaps what was written in the dust wasn't names or sins, but something even more radical, a verdict that didn't need a voice, just a finger. A dismissal not to escape the law, but to fulfill it in a way no one expected. Not guilty. Case dismissed. You may go. And the wind, always faithful, swept the words away. Sometimes a gesture is more than a gesture. Sometimes a man doesn't write because he must, but because the act itself becomes the message. No audience is needed. No explanation is given. Just a body in motion and silence stretched so long that meaning begins to shimmer where words refuse to go. That is what many scholars have suggested about Jesus' writing in the dust, that it was not simply an answer or a trick or even a verdict, but a performance. A prophetic one. A living parable unfolding right there on the temple floor. The Hebrew prophets were known for this. Isaiah walked naked and barefoot for 3 years to symbolize the coming exile. Ezekiel lay on one side for 390 days, eating meager food cooked over coals to dramatize the siege of Jerusalem. Hosea married a prostitute to reflect God's heartbreak over Israel's unfaithfulness. These weren't just strange acts. They were physical theology messages the body delivered when the tongue could no longer carry the weight. Seen in that light, Jesus' gesture becomes part of that lineage. He doesn't rise to debate. He doesn't condemn or defend. He enacts. He moves into the space of the prophets not by shouting or proclaiming, but by pressing a finger into dust. The gesture becomes the sermon. The act becomes the answer. Some scholars refer to this as embodied prophecy, a term used to describe those moments in Scripture when divine truth is acted rather than spoken. In a culture where public memory relied heavily on sight and repetition, these performances had staying power. The people didn't just hear the prophet. They watched him. They told their children. The image lived longer than the words. So imagine the crowd watching Jesus. No one knows exactly what he's doing. There's confusion, hesitation, perhaps even suspicion. But no one moves. Because something is happening. And though the meaning may not be clear, the moment demands attention. The accusers, for all their certainty, don't interrupt. The woman doesn't protest. The crowd leans in. And Jesus, without saying a word, begins the slow, deliberate work of drawing in the earth. The dust itself becomes part of the message, a symbol of mortality, of impermanence, of beginnings and ends. There's a callback here not just to dust as judgment or dust as dismissal, but dust as medium. From the very start of Scripture, dust has carried weight. Man formed from it, life returning to it. And now, in a prophetic echo, it receives the trace of divine thought, not in thunder, but in gesture. And unlike Isaiah or Ezekiel, Jesus does not have to explain his action. He does not declare, "This is what the Lord says." He is the message, the Word made flesh. The writing is not the point. The movement is. That may explain why the Gospel never records what was written. Because the act itself, the bending, the silence, the presence that was the prophecy. It wasn't about letters or phrases. It was about posture, position, power redefined through humility. There's a fascinating parallel found in the prophet Jeremiah. At one point, God instructs him to go to the potter's house and watch as a vessel is being formed. The potter reshapes the clay when it is marred, not discarding it, but beginning again. It's a parable of judgment and mercy told without a single spoken word. Just motion. Just hands on earth. That image glows beneath the scene in John's Gospel. Jesus' hands on dust reshaping a moment that others had already condemned. The accusers thought the woman was a finished object, her guilt baked in. But the one who kneels sees a vessel still being formed. Not perfect, but not discarded either. Some mystics even suggest that this was an echo of creation itself. The Genesis moment when God breathed into dust and made man. Now dust is touched again, not to create a body, but to restore a soul. It's poetic, of course, but powerful. The prophet doesn't need to say, "This is new creation." He just moves, and the dust remembers. As in all prophetic acts, the meaning remains partly veiled. That's the point. Prophecy, especially in its performed form, invites contemplation, not certainty. It disturbs, it stirs, it waits, and those who witness it must choose whether to see or to turn away. That's likely what happened to the crowd. They came for judgment. They stayed for mystery. And one by one, faced with something they couldn't explain but couldn't deny, they left. It's worth noting that this wasn't the only time Jesus used embodied silence to subvert power. He rode into Jerusalem not on a war horse but on a donkey. He washed the feet of his disciples rather than command them. He stood mute before Pilate, refusing to defend himself. These were all acts loaded with meaning. Not performances for applause, but living riddles meant to be wrestled with. The writing in the dust fits perfectly within that pattern. It is a moment that refuses to be pinned down, not because it is empty, but because it is too full. Full of tension, of mercy, of divine disruption. And like all good prophecy, it doesn't end when the gesture stops. It lingers. It ripples. It moves outward through the centuries, unsettling hearts, confusing scholars, inspiring preachers, haunting the edges of our understanding. He wrote. Then he stood. And the stones never flew. For those watching that day, the sight of Jesus writing may have sparked an unexpected reaction, not just confusion or tension, but surprise. Because for all his teaching, his parables, his debates with the scribes and Pharisees, Jesus was not widely seen as a writer. He was a speaker, a storyteller, a rabbi who taught in the open air, who walked from village to village, delivering truth through voice, not stylus. And yet here he was, in the most delicate and dangerous moment of his ministry, silently writing with his finger in the ground. That simple gesture, kneeling, drawing, not speaking, might have startled more than just his accusers. Because in the first-century Jewish world, literacy was not universal. Far from it. While some Jewish men were educated in scripture and law, many could not read or write beyond basic inscriptions. Formal writing was the work of scribes, professionals, trained in the delicate work of copying, interpreting, and preserving sacred texts. Scribes were elite, often aligned with power structures, and central to the preservation of religious tradition. Jesus was not a scribe, at least not in the formal sense. He wasn't trained in the temple schools. He wasn't one of the official interpreters of law. His authority came not from degrees or scrolls, but from the crowds who heard his voice and were astonished. The Gospels repeatedly note that people were amazed that he taught with authority, not like the scribes. That distinction mattered. He wasn't part of the institution. He was something else entirely. And so when he bent down to write, the moment itself may have broken expectation. This wasn't just an act of judgment or deflection. It was an intrusion into scribal space, a realm usually reserved for those who wore robes and carried ink-stained fingers. He, the wandering rabbi, the carpenter's son, now traced lines in the very dust of the temple. To write in that setting was to claim something unusual, not just knowledge, but authorship. Some scholars note that there's no record of Jesus writing anything else during his ministry. No letters, no scrolls, no codices penned in his name. His message was oral embodied, passed through voice and gesture, which makes this single recorded moment of writing stand out all the more. It's as if he reserved that act, that form, for precisely this one confrontation, and that gives it weight. There's also something deeply ironic about the timing. The scribes, whose entire identity was built around the written word, bring him a woman for judgment. They are the experts, the ones with texts and tradition behind them. And yet in the most charged moment, they do not write. They speak, they accuse, but they do not inscribe. Jesus, by contrast, does not speak, at least not at first. He writes. The reversal is stunning. The non-scribe becomes the only one with a pen in hand, so to speak. That irony deepens when you remember that the accusation was about law, the written kind. Moses commanded us to stone such women, they say, invoking the authority of the written Torah. But their knowledge is selective. Moses did write about adultery, yes. But he also wrote about witnesses, about due process, about mercy and justice intertwined. They cling to the letter while ignoring the spirit. And Jesus quite literally responds by returning to the earth, the very medium of man, and writing a new answer. Not in stone, not on scroll, but in the dust. The callback here is subtle but sharp. The law of Moses came down written. So did the commandments. So did the condemnations of prophets. But now Jesus, the Word made flesh, writes not to command, but to disarm. His writing does not initiate a covenant. It diffuses a bomb. It breaks a cycle. It turns a moment of death into a breath of life. And he does it astonishingly, through a form no one expected from him. This may be why the moment struck so deeply. The crowd knew Jesus as a teacher, a healer, a disruptor. But now they saw him do something that aligned him with scribes, judges, and prophets all at once. Without saying a word, he stepped into a new role. And once again, the system didn't know how to respond. Even today, this is what gives the gesture its mystery. We don't think of Jesus as a writer, not in the usual sense. His followers wrote for him. The evangelists told his story. Paul expanded his theology. But the man himself he wrote only once, in dust. And not a single word of it remains. Which brings us to a deeper question. If the act was so striking, why didn't the gospel preserve what he wrote? Perhaps because the surprise wasn't the content. It was the form. It was the shock of seeing him do it at all. The meaning wasn't in the letters traced. It was in the silence, the authority, the break from expectation. It was in the realization that he, though he taught like a poet, could also write like a judge. And then, as quietly as he began, he stopped. The writing faded, the wind stirred, and the surprise lingered, because in that one motion, the carpenter became scribe, the teacher became judge, and the accused woman was no longer the only one standing on trial. The temple was more than stone and sacrifice. It was an archive, a living library of scrolls, laws, and the men who guarded them. In that world, scribes didn't just copy words. They held power, not the kind that shouted or marched, but the quieter, more enduring sort, the power to define, interpret, preserve, and protect the Word of God. They were the stewards of sacred memory, the ones who translated divine fire into parchment and ink. To the ordinary worshiper, the scribes may have seemed like background figures. But in truth, they were indispensable to the machinery of religious life. Their authority came not from charisma or prophecy, but from expertise. They knew the law. They knew where to find it, how to explain it, and how to defend it when challenged. Their presence in the temple wasn't optional. It was foundational. So now picture Jesus kneeling on that same temple floor, writing in the dust. He is not a scribe. He is not dressed as one, trained as one, or sanctioned by the Scribal class. And yet, in that moment, he steps directly into their domain. With no scroll, no ink, no desk, he begins to write in the presence of the very people whose identities depend on their exclusive access to written law. That gesture wasn't just unexpected, it was subversive. He doesn't quote scripture aloud as rabbis might. He doesn't unroll a scroll. He performs an act that would typically be reserved for the temple's literate elite. And he does it not with ink on parchment, but with finger in earth. The scribes trained in permanence are faced with impermanence. The ones who spend their lives writing what must not be altered now see something written that will not last at all, and yet leaves a mark deeper than any ink. There's a historical tension here, one that scholars sometimes overlook. Jesus, throughout his ministry, consistently challenged the scribes not for their literacy, but for their legalism. He respected the law, but not how it had been weaponized. He honored Scripture but resisted those who twisted it to crush rather than to heal. And in this moment, surrounded by scribes and Pharisees, he doesn't out-debate them. He out-acts them. He enters their realm and with one slow motion exposes the hollowness of their trap. Some early Jewish sources even describe temple scribes as those who sit in Moses' seat, a reference to interpretive authority. They didn't just write the law, they mediated it. Their interpretations could become binding. That's why the Pharisees' appeal to Mosaic command carried so much weight. They were invoking the chain of authority and expecting Jesus to submit to it. Instead, he kneels. And with that posture, he flips the hierarchy. There's an obscure commentary from the 4th century that paints this image sharply. It says that by writing in the dust of the temple floor, Jesus was scribing over the scribes. A strange phrase, but powerful. It suggests that he wasn't dismissing their role, he was surpassing it. Not tearing up the law, but reminding them that the law belongs to God, not to those who copy it most often. The callback here is gentle but deliberate. Recall how earlier Jesus exposed their misunderstanding of witness and law, not by rejecting it, but by clarifying its application. He did the same now with scribal authority. By writing, he didn't need to quote. By writing, he didn't need to argue. He stepped into the visual space of the scribes and said in effect, I too can write. But I write for mercy, not condemnation. It's not that he stole their authority. It's that he revealed how thin it had become. The scribes, for all their ink and training, could not write mercy into the law. They could only enforce what had already been written. But here was someone who, with no scroll in sight, seemed to write something new, something alive. This is why the act of writing in dust was more than poetic. It was political. It challenged the very structure of religious control. Not loudly, not violently, but undeniably. The ones with the scrolls stood silent while the one with dust spoke volumes. And yet what he wrote still vanished. No parchment preserved it. No disciple copied it. The writing, like the system it confronted, was temporary. But the moment lasted. In the end, the scribes left the scene not in triumph, but in silence. Not because they were overpowered, but because they were bypassed. Their legal trap failed, their position undermined. And the man who knelt before them walked away, having done what they could not deliver, both justice and mercy, without a single drop of ink. There are moments when judgment doesn't need to be spoken, when it lands not through voice or verdict, but through silence and gaze and the unbearable weight of self-recognition. That's what began to settle over the temple courtyard, after Jesus bent down and drew his finger through the dust. Shame, creeping in quiet and heavy, filled the space like a rising tide. Not the shame of the woman, surprisingly, though she stood exposed, but the shame of the accusers, the ones who had come certain, righteous, armed with stones and scripture. And yet, as the silence grew, their certainty dissolved. One by one, their hands slackened, their eyes dropped, their feet edged backward. Not because Jesus attacked them, but because he didn't. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He gave them something far worse, a mirror. A gesture that forced them to see themselves not through the lens of their authority, but through the eyes of the accused. Shame is a strange thing. It doesn't always show up when guilt is proven. Sometimes it arrives earlier in the moment, when a person realizes that their confidence is hollow, their motivations not as pure as they claimed. That's what Jesus unearthed, not with a word, but with a gesture. By stooping by writing, by refusing to engage in the performative morality of the trap, he created a space in which reflection became inescapable. Some psychologists have suggested that shame requires two conditions: exposure and empathy. The accuser must feel seen not just in their actions, but in their inner motive. That's what happened in that courtyard. The men who brought the woman forward were seen not in their robes, not in their role, but in their hearts. And what they saw there must have stung. It's telling that the text says they left one by one, beginning with the eldest. That detail has always struck readers as oddly specific. Why mention the order? Why the elders first? Some say it's because the older men had more to remember. More sins, more secrets, more years of pretending. Others suggest that they simply had the wisdom to recognize what was happening, to understand that they had walked into a trap of their own making. Either way, the chain reaction unfolds slowly, not in panic, not in protest, but in quiet retreat. Shame doesn't always spark defense. Sometimes it triggers a slow withdrawal, not out of fear, but out of recognition. A quiet internal voice saying, "I can't stand here any longer." The callback is unmistakable. The law they invoked required witnesses to cast the first stones, but none stepped forward. Not one. Not because the law failed, but because their moral standing to fulfill it collapsed under its own weight. Shame in this moment becomes the great leveler. It silences the accusers without humiliating them. It disarms them without violence. It convicts them without condemnation. What Jesus did was psychologically masterful. He didn't confront them directly. He didn't argue the law or challenge their intentions. He created a moment where they confronted themselves. The line he spoke, "Let the one among you who is without sin cast the first stone," wasn't just clever. It was surgical. It slipped past their legal armor and struck the hidden space they hadn't guarded: their conscience. Some scholars have suggested that shame was Jesus' tool of choice in this moment, not as punishment, but as awakening. That's what makes the scene so unsettling. Everyone expected fire. What they received was a quiet reckoning, the kind that lingers, the kind that doesn't go away when the dust is swept and the courtyard is empty. And what of the woman, still silent, still standing? Her shame, assumed by the crowd, begins to dissolve as theirs blooms into view. In a reversal, no one expected the victim of public humiliation becomes the least humiliated person present. She doesn't run, she doesn't plead, she just waits. And in waiting becomes something new, not the object of scorn, but the witness to grace. That reversal is profound. The ones who came to shame her leave in shame. The one who was dragged forward remains standing. And the man at the center, the one who knelt and wrote, remains utterly still, letting each person navigate their own undoing. This moment also reveals something rare about Jesus' method. He allows people to arrive at truth themselves. He doesn't force it. He doesn't corner them with logic or overwhelm them with force. He sets the stage and waits. And in that space, something ancient happens, the slow human realization of moral failure. Not because someone told you, but because for the first time you looked. And so the courtyard empties. No stones fall, no sentences are shouted. Shame has done its work not to destroy, but to reveal. And once it has, there's nothing left to say. Dust lingers. Footprints fade. And the woman no longer a pawn in someone else's game remains. Not condemned, not shamed, just there, waiting for whatever comes next. The ground beneath our feet rarely feels important. It's something we walk on, brush away, forget. But in Scripture, dust is never just dust. It is a symbol, a medium, a reminder. From Genesis to Revelation, dust is where man begins and where man returns. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return. That line is more than poetic. It's theological. It reminds the proud that they are made of fragile things. And in that temple courtyard, where justice and shame swirled like wind, it was into that dust that Jesus bent low and wrote. What he traced, words or symbols or silence itself, is still unknown. But the choice of canvas was not. He could have spoken. He could have pointed to a scroll or quoted a commandment. Instead, he turned to the earth. The impermanent, the easily erased. That choice tells us something. The message was not meant to endure on stone. It was meant to echo in memory. Sand and dust behave differently than parchment. They hold the mark only briefly. A gust of wind, a footstep, a shift of light, and it's gone. That impermanence is part of the power. Because what fades from sight must be carried elsewhere. In this case, in the minds of the accusers, in the trembling breath of the woman, and in the centuries that followed, as generations tried to imagine what those lines meant, precisely because they didn't last. Some traditions say Jesus wrote twice, bending, standing, speaking, then stooping again. 2 gestures, 2 messages, the first to the accusers, the second, perhaps, to the accused. If so, the dust received both judgment and mercy. It became the meeting ground of opposites, where sin and grace brushed shoulders, where condemnation hovered and then dissipated. In ancient times, dust also had legal symbolism. In mourning, people sat in it or poured it over their heads. In moments of covenant, it was used to draw symbolic lines, to divide spaces, to mark territory. Writing in dust then wasn't neutral. It was layered. It suggested temporality, humility, the thin veil between life and death. When Jesus wrote in it, he wasn't choosing a random surface. He was choosing the very thing humanity returns to when all illusions are stripped away. There's a callback here, quiet but strong, to the fragility of the scribe's authority. They relied on ink, on parchment, on permanence. But Jesus showed that a message didn't need to last physically to endure spiritually. In fact, by writing in a medium that vanishes, he may have ensured that the gesture itself became unforgettable. The words fade. The memory remains. Modern scholars sometimes puzzle over why this moment has such staying power. After all, the actual message is lost. But maybe that's the point. If we had the exact words, we would argue over them. We'd carve them into walls, print them onto T-shirts, make them into slogans. But by allowing the message to disappear, the story refuses to be reduced. It becomes a living parable, one that each reader must enter and interpret for themselves. Dust in many cultures is also where memory hides. Think of footprints, paths through the wilderness, traces of passage. Dust remembers movement. It tells you that someone was here, that someone passed this way. But not for long. It invites attention, but not obsession. It speaks, but softly. That's how this moment works. Not as doctrine carved in certainty, but as a trace, a whisper, a line barely held. And yet it's the one physical act Jesus performed in that whole encounter. No healings, no miracles, just dust, just the movement of a finger, and everything changes. Some mystics have said that the ground received more than writing that day, that it received the touch of heaven, that in bending down, Jesus didn't just draw letters, he blessed the very earth. He reminded those present that the sacred isn't just in scrolls and rituals, but in the dust they walked on, the dust that remembered their steps even when they tried to forget their sins. The image of that writing lingers, perhaps, because we all know what it's like to want something erased and to fear that it won't be. We know what it's like to wish our failings could be drawn not in ink but in sand, to pray that mercy would come not through stone tablets, but through a line we can no longer see but can still feel. And yet there's peace in that fragility. Because if Jesus wrote in dust, it means he never intended for the accusation to last. He didn't write her sentence. He wrote her release. He didn't carve her sin. He traced the moment that it was named, faced, and then forgiven. So the dust forgets. The wind carries it away. But memory, holy, personal, enduring, remains. Not the memory of words, but of grace. A grace written not in permanence, but in presence. And that perhaps is the real miracle, that something so impermanent could leave behind something that never leaves us. She never speaks, not during the uproar, not as the crowd circles, not even when the trap tightens and all eyes turn to her like knives. She stands, says nothing, and waits. It's a detail so easy to miss in a scene full of drama, but it lingers once noticed. The woman caught in adultery never utters a word until Jesus addresses her directly. And even then, what she says is brief. Only 2 words, "No one, Lord." Her silence is often interpreted as shame, and perhaps it is. She's been seized, dragged, paraded into the temple like an object lesson. Her name isn't recorded. Her partner in the act is conspicuously absent, and now surrounded by robes and judgment and stones and strangers, she stands alone. What is there to say? What explanation would change this moment? Her accusers don't ask for her side. They don't seem to care. She is evidence, not a person, a pretext, not a presence. So she says nothing. But silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's the only defense left. Sometimes it's dignity in a world determined to strip it away. And what's striking, what ripples quietly beneath the surface of this story, is that Jesus seems to honor that silence. He doesn't interrogate her. He doesn't make her confess. He doesn't demand that she explain herself in front of the crowd. Instead, he speaks around her, and then finally to her, gently, directly, and only after everyone else has left. The dynamic is astonishing. The accusers arrive with noise, they shout, they frame the law like a weapon. But the woman and Jesus share silence. In that stillness, a different kind of justice begins to unfold, one rooted not in performance or proof, but in presence. There's a callback here, subtle but important. Think of how shame worked its way through the crowd, how it unraveled the trap not through force, but through quiet. That same quiet surrounds the woman, but in her case it doesn't convict. It protects. It creates space. Some interpreters believe her silence shows guilt. Others believe it shows fear. But there's another possibility that her silence is faith. Not grand, not articulated, but raw and trembling. A willingness to remain, to not run, to stand in the presence of the one person who doesn't look at her like an object. And when she finally does speak, after the accusers have left, after Jesus asks her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" Her answer is quiet but profound, "No one, Lord." It's not a speech. It's not a defense. Just a naming of what has happened. And in those few words is the entire arc of the encounter. The accusation has vanished. The crowd has dispersed. The trap has collapsed. She is still standing, still silent, but seen. That exchange is among the shortest dialogues in the Gospels, and yet it carries immense emotional weight. Jesus' response, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on sin no more," is not just a reprieve. It is restoration. It gives her something the others never intended, to agency. Her silence is no longer forced. It's honored. Her voice, when she finally uses it, is met not with condemnation, but with release. This moment has haunted and healed generations. Women, especially in ages where silence was survival, have seen themselves in her. Misunderstood, misused, dragged into places they didn't choose, judged before being heard. And yet here in this ancient courtyard, a new script unfolds. One where silence isn't failure. It's space for grace to speak first. The woman's lack of words also invites the listener to lean in more closely. Her silence becomes a space we're invited to fill, not with our assumptions, but with reflection. What would we say in her place? What stones have we barely escaped? What silences have shielded us when words would have only sharpened the wound? There's something poetic, too, in how the story's loudest voices disappear first. The ones who came to speak end up speechless. The one who came in silence is the last to remain. It flips the expected order. The courtroom empties, but the defendant remains, not because she argued her case well, but because she was willing to stand still while grace did its work. And though the moment ends with words, a gentle command to leave sin behind, it began and was sustained by quiet. The woman didn't need to plead. She didn't need to perform. She needed to stay. In that stillness, we find perhaps the truest echo of mercy. Not always loud, not always visible, but certain, soft, strong enough to hold the weight of everything unsaid. From the outer edge of the scene, the disciples may have watched in silence, not interfering, not drawing attention, but absorbing every detail. They had seen Jesus perform miracles, feed thousands, calm storms. But what unfolded in the temple courtyard that morning was something altogether different. No spectacle, no healing, no parable in the usual sense. Just a gesture, a pause, a wordless teaching that unfolded in the tension between accusation and mercy. And while the crowd witnessed judgment turn to grace, it's possible that the disciples saw something else, as well, a lesson meant just for them. Jesus was always teaching, even when he wasn't explaining. His followers learned not only from his words, but from his posture, his silence, his restraint. This moment when he bent to write in the dust was unlike any teaching they had encountered. There were no riddles to decode, no stories to parse. It was quiet. And yet it resonated. Not just because of what was prevented a stoning, but because of what was revealed, how power could be exercised through mercy, how authority could look like stillness. Some interpreters suggest this scene may have been as much a lesson for the disciples as it was a trap set by the Pharisees. Not just a test of Jesus, but a demonstration for those who would carry his message forward. How do you respond to injustice? How do you face law twisted into violence? How do you show strength without becoming a mirror of the very power you reject? He didn't answer with a parable this time. He answered with his body by stooping, writing, and refusing to play by the terms of the accusers. There's a quiet callback here to earlier moments in his ministry, those times when he taught that the first shall be last, that the meek shall inherit the earth, that the merciful are blessed. But here the principle becomes embodiment. No lecture, just example. And perhaps the disciples standing back saw this not only as a confrontation diffused, but as a pattern to follow. The silence, the stillness, the refusal to shout back all of it becomes a kind of non-verbal instruction. Not just about sin and forgiveness, but about leadership, about presence, about resisting the easy pull of spectacle and outrage. It is one thing to preach mercy. It is another to live it in the face of fury. Some scholars suggest that the vagueness of the written message, its absence from the text, was intentional. That Jesus didn't need the words preserved because the act itself was the point. The lesson wasn't in the content. It was in the form. The disciples wouldn't remember what he wrote, but they would never forget that he wrote. And that's the genius of the moment. Its mystery is what makes it linger. Had the gospel said plainly he wrote this, we might have focused all our attention on the words. But instead, we're left with the motion, the posture, the timing, and those are the things that form disciples, not just scholars. The lesson wasn't for the curious, it was for the committed. It's not hard to imagine the disciples recalling that moment later as they faced their own trials, their own confrontations. Perhaps Peter remembered it when asked to choose between the sword and surrender. Perhaps John carried it with him as he watched his teacher nailed to wood in silence. The way Jesus had handled power, not grasping it, but kneeling, must have shaped their understanding of what it meant to follow him. Even the dust plays a role in that hidden teaching. Dust, fleeting as it is, becomes the medium for memory. The line he drew, whatever it was, passed away in moments. But the shape of the act, the quiet within the chaos, the mercy within the accusation, stayed. Modern interpreters often read this moment through the lens of moral theology or legal commentary, but viewed from the disciples' perspective, it becomes something more intimate. It becomes a masterclass in restraint, a wordless sermon on justice, a blueprint for how to lead without crushing, how to stand for truth without raising a weapon. And Jesus, ever the teacher, doesn't turn and explain it. He lets the moment speak. He lets the disciples watch. He knows that the deepest teachings are not always heard in lectures, but in rooms where the air is thick with silence, and the dust still carries the shape of mercy. They would remember. Not the words, but the weight. Not the outcome, but the method. Not the answers, but the quiet refusal to be drawn into cruelty disguised as righteousness. And when their own day came to choose between law and love, vengeance and forgiveness, they would have this image to guide them, their teacher kneeling in dust, writing something no one else could see and changing everything. There is something oddly deliberate about the silence. In a gospel filled with signs and sayings, parables and prayers, why would this one moment, this strange, almost whispered episode preserve the gesture but not the message? Jesus bends down, writes on the ground, and nothing more is said. The act is recorded twice even, but the words are not. And that curious omission has led some to wonder, what if the words were known and later erased? Among New Testament scholars and textual critics there exists a theory known informally as the lost words hypothesis. It proposes that what Jesus wrote was originally included in early versions of the story, but was removed not because it didn't matter, but precisely because it did. According to this theory, the omission was not an oversight, but a suppression. There are ancient writings where redactions are plainly visible, erasures, overwrites, scribal glosses squeezed into margins. Some gospel manuscripts show signs of tampering or selective editing, especially in passages that stirred theological discomfort or threatened ecclesiastical authority. And few moments in the New Testament are as theologically awkward as Jesus halting the lawful execution of a sinner by drawing in the dirt. It may seem a stretch to claim that someone intentionally cut the words out, but early church controversies were filled with debates over doctrine, power, and interpretation. A phrase written by Jesus that might be read as too lenient, too subversive, or too ambiguous could pose a problem for authorities eager to present a consistent message, especially if the words favored forgiveness over judgment in a way that seemed to contradict Mosaic law. And then there's the curious fact that the Gospel of John is often the most symbolically rich, the most layered, the most prone to hidden meanings. Why would John, of all the evangelists, insert such a visually dramatic detail, Jesus writing on the ground, and then leave the content of the writing a blank? One answer is that the act was the message. Another more provocative one is that the content was once there and then removed. We've seen how other passages, such as the longer ending of Mark or the Johannine comma in 1 John, show evidence of editorial decisions. Not to mention the countless apocryphal Gospels that preserve sayings of Jesus never accepted into canon. What if in one of these now lost oral traditions or marginal notes, the missing words were once preserved? Some even speculate, though this drifts toward the speculative, that those lost words may have existed in texts that were later destroyed. Perhaps they were preserved in apocryphal letters or whispered by early followers before being branded heretical. Perhaps they circulated too widely to be dismissed outright, but too dangerously to be left alone. The tension is undeniable. Had Jesus simply spoken his message aloud, there would be no mystery. But by choosing to write, and by that writing being left unread, we're placed in an interpretive fog, one where the silence becomes a signal. Something was said, something that mattered, something we're not allowed to know, or something the author deliberately chose not to repeat. And the most haunting possibility is that someone somewhere did know, that a disciple saw it, that the woman saw it, that even the accusers read what was written and dropped their stones not out of fear, but because of what they saw written in the dust. This theory connects us to earlier ideas, the notion that he might have written their sins, or a verse of warning, or the names of the accusers. It could also fit with the lost prophetic traditions that appear in some Gnostic texts, Gospels, that claim to carry secret sayings of Jesus. None mention this specific moment, but absence is not always evidence of nothingness. Sometimes it's the quiet where you expect sound that signals something was hushed. The idea of a suppressed phrase is uncomfortable, particularly for traditions that view the Bible as inviolable. But history shows us that sacred texts were not always treated with uniform reverence. They were debated, fought over, redacted, sometimes even destroyed. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, fragments of the Gospel of the Hebrews, all whisper of a broader library that once existed. If the words Jesus wrote on the ground were once written in ink, they may now be among those lost lines drifting at the edges of canon, erased from the page but not from the echo. It would explain the tension in the passage, the way it draws attention to something it won't define. And this is where the theory bends toward poetry, that perhaps what was written was never meant to remain. Perhaps it was true only in the moment for the eyes of those present. A sentence too sharp for the page, too gentle for doctrine, too holy for ink. Perhaps the words were always meant to vanish like breath on glass, like justice wrapped in mercy, like letters traced in dust and lifted by the wind. If you listen closely at the edges of the canonical Gospels, you can almost hear a chorus of distant voices, fragmentary, half-forgotten, but insistent. These are the echoes from the Apocryphal texts, the Gnostic Gospels, the lost writings that once circled the early Christian world like ghostly satellites. They were not included in the official canon, but they preserve hints, traces, and sometimes startling expansions of familiar scenes. And in the case of Jesus writing on the ground, some researchers wonder if these alternate texts may hold slivers of context that help explain this elusive gesture. None of the known apocryphal Gospels, at least not those we've found intact, retell the episode exactly as it appears in John. The woman caught in adultery, the accusing crowd, the writing in the dirt, that specific constellation belongs solely to the Gospel of John. And yet the themes that surround it, divine silence, secret teachings, confrontations with legal authorities, cryptic actions that carry deeper meanings, appear throughout these fringe Gospels. Take, for instance, the Gospel of the Hebrews, preserved only in quotes from early church writers. One fragment describes Jesus writing the names of the righteous in the book of life, a phrase that feels uncannily close to the inverse of Jeremiah's line about sinners being written in the earth. Or consider the Gospel of the Egyptians, where Jesus delivers secret teachings to his disciples not publicly, but through signs and veiled sayings. These writings may not recount the scene in John 8 directly, but they suggest a pattern: Jesus acting through gesture, through silence, through symbol rather than speech. The Gospel of Thomas, perhaps the most famous non-canonical text, contains sayings that emphasize inner knowing and mystery. In it, Jesus says, "I am not your master. Because you have drunk, you have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring which I have tended." In another line, he challenges his followers to interpret a riddle rather than accept a statement. It's not hard to imagine a Jesus who responds to violence not with words, but with something deeper and stranger, like writing in the dirt without explanation. And then there's the Gospel of Mary, which doesn't involve the dirt writing episode but features Mary Magdalene recounting a hidden teaching from Jesus that the male disciples refused to accept. The central theme that true understanding comes not from rigid law, but from inner revelation. Again, it echoes the context of the woman's story, where judgment gives way to reflection, and authority is redefined by mercy. Fragments of the so-called Gospel of the Savior, discovered in Egypt, include scenes where Jesus speaks in riddles about divine justice and human blindness. One particularly haunting line has him saying, "You read the signs of the sky, but not the words beneath your feet." Scholars debate the authenticity of that line, but even if it is apocryphal in every sense, the imagery is hard to ignore. Words beneath your feet, written in the dust, hidden from those who walk over them unseeing. What these texts collectively suggest is not a secret answer to what Jesus wrote on the ground, but a sensibility. They reinforce the idea that his teachings often came in forms designed to provoke thought rather than deliver clarity. That he trusted his audience to engage, to reflect, and sometimes to sit with mystery rather than solve it. Some might dismiss these echoes as little more than literary noise, half-formed theological experiments that failed the test of orthodoxy. But they remain valuable not as replacements for the gospel account, but as prisms through which to view it. They suggest that even in the early decades after Jesus' life, there was already a recognition that not everything he did was meant to be fully explained. And curiously, many of these texts center around women. Mary Magdalene, Salome, the unnamed interlocutors in Gnostic dialogues, figures who receive revelations or ask questions that others ignore. It aligns in a subtle way with the woman in John 8. She says nothing. She is spoken about, judged, and then spared not by an argument, but by a gesture. That's not a resolution. It's a space, a void where meaning unfolds in private. In a way, the presence of so many texts that don't retell this scene serves to emphasize its uniqueness, and yet their very silence on it may be telling. Perhaps the story was too fragile to transmit widely, or perhaps it existed in oral form longer than others. Maybe it was a moment preserved not for mass repetition, but for those who needed it most. Those whose sins were visible, whose shame was public, whose hope for mercy depended not on theological approval, but on the unexpected compassion of a man who bent down and refused to condemn. The alternative Gospels do not give us the missing words, but they remind us that early Christians lived with mystery. They didn't expect all the blanks to be filled in. Sometimes they embraced the spaces between the lines, the gestures that went unrecorded. They knew that Jesus often spoke loudest when he said nothing at all. And so we return to the dirt. We've circled the temple courtyard, from every angle peered over the shoulders of Pharisees, followed Jesus' finger as it moved across the ground, traced echoes from ancient courtrooms to lost gospels. We've heard the silence of the woman, the rustling robes of retreating accusers, and the strange weight of a moment recorded with deliberate ambiguity. But at last, with all that swirling dust now settled, we ask the question once more, not rhetorically, but as investigators standing at the edge of mystery. What did it mean, not necessarily what he wrote, but why he wrote? At this point in the investigation, one thing is clear, almost frustratingly so. The Gospel never tells us the content of the writing. And while many have tried to guess from names to sins to scriptural verses, every theory returns us to the same unavoidable reality: the act mattered more than the message. That is, unless the act was the message. Jesus didn't answer the accusers with words. He didn't correct their interpretation of the law, didn't launch into a sermon about hypocrisy or forgiveness. Instead, he stooped. Not once, but twice. First before the challenge, then again after it intensified. The body language is unmistakable. He places himself lower than everyone else, than the teachers of the law, than the accused woman, even than the dust itself. And into that dust he writes. Theologians have called it a pause, a delay tactic, a theatrical gesture. But maybe it was a mirror. Because in that silence, the accusers saw themselves not through argument, but through absence. Through that deliberate non-response, each man, one by one, realized something wasn't quite right. Maybe they remembered Jeremiah's warning that those who abandon God have their names written in the earth. Maybe they recognized the echo of Daniel's divine handwriting on Belshazzar's wall. Maybe they just felt it, the shame, the exposure, the sudden collapse of certainty. There's an odd reversal in this scene. The ones who came to accuse find themselves examined. The one who stood in silence is lifted up. And the one man with the right to judge chooses not to. That's not just a clever resolution. It's a subversion, a reordering, and the act that makes it possible is writing. Writing in dust. Writing that vanishes. Dust in the Hebrew imagination is more than dirt. It's the material of creation, what Adam was formed, from what returns to the earth in death, what fills the valleys of lamentation and promise. Writing in it, then, is more than an idle scribble. It is inscribing meaning into impermanence. It is framing a moment that cannot be preserved. The writing is not meant to last, because neither is condemnation. That perhaps is the final answer, and yet it remains deliberately open. Jesus offers no interpretation. No one asks what he wrote. No disciple records it later. No tradition claims to preserve it with certainty. We are left not with knowledge but with posture. The posture of bending. The posture of release. The posture of those who walk away and the one who stays behind with a woman whose future is suddenly wide open. The scene doesn't resolve with a lesson but with a choice. Go and sin no more. The mystery lingers, but so does mercy. And if Jesus wrote anything in that dust, perhaps it was not meant to be read with eyes, but felt with conscience. Now the dust has settled. The courtyard is empty. The accusers are gone. The woman has walked away, her fate somehow changed by a silence that spoke louder than law. And Jesus, he stands where the tension once gathered, where words were never recorded, where his hand traced meaning into something as fleeting as dirt. You're left with the same question that started this long unraveling: why did he write on the ground, not just as a quirk, not as a historical footnote, but as a deliberate act captured by a gospel that otherwise wastes no space? It lingers because it was meant to. And perhaps that's the whole point. Maybe the mystery was never meant to be solved like a puzzle, but to be held softly, reverently, like a handful of sand that slips through your fingers. Because history has limits, so do words. And in this one moment, more than any parable or proclamation, Jesus reminds you that the holiest messages are often the ones that vanish before you can grasp them. Not because they're lost, but because they're meant to live somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere deeper. So rest easy now. The question won't go away. It isn't supposed to. Let it hover in the background of your thoughts like dust in a shaft of temple light. Let it settle wherever it's needed. And if you ever feel condemned or unsure, or like the words written about you can't be erased, remember the hand that stooped, the silence that defended the ground that didn't hold the ink for long. Some things are meant to fade, and some mysteries are meant to stay with you.